So there are many cases in modern media where people use old Shakespearean English to sound old and fancy. But what if I told you though that the majority of the time this Shakespearean English isn't at all correct? For example, one of the biggest mistakes that I see all the time is people using thou to be polite and fancy. But actually, thou was historically the informal pronoun while you was a formal one. If you know any Romance languages like Spanish, then you should be familiar with this concept since Spanish also has two pronouns depending on the formality. Spanish uses usted when being polite. This is typically used when you want to address someone who is of higher social standing or older. Meanwhile, tú is an informal pronoun used to address people who you're casual with, like friends or individuals who are just younger than you. This was exactly the case with English, except with you and thou instead. But why do so many people associate thou with formality nowadays? I think the main reason is due to thou being often used to address God in the Bible. But the reason thou is used in the Bible is not because they're trying to show respect and formality to God, but rather the opposite. The use of thou is meant to demonstrate that there's this feeling of closeness and familiarity with God. It signifies a personal relationship. This goes for other translations of the Bible as well. For example, in Spanish, they utilize tú rather than usted to address God, and German uses du rather than sie. Although that's not the only thing that people get wrong about using the word thou. You've probably heard about the words thee, thy, and thine. Often than not, many people just switch between these without really knowing how to use them. Before we get into that though, let's talk about today's sponsor for the video, Skillshare. I've recently been using Skillshare to improve my writing abilities as a new content creator. I'm so used to writing essays for school that I've really never learned how to write a natural script or a blog post. With Skillshare though, I've been learning these skills to help improve my content creation. Specifically, I've been taking a course called Educate and Entertain by David Johan Lensing. But what is Skillshare? Well, Skillshare is the largest online learning community with thousands of classes led by industry experts across various fields such as animation, illustration, design, freelance, productivity, and so much more. With Skillshare, you'll be able to take your career, skills, passions, and hobbies to the next level. And if you're having a hard time choosing a specific class, Skillshare has learning paths, which are curated sequential class collections to master a certain skill. In fact, fall is one of the best times for learning a new skill. With it being back to school season, along with the weather cooling down, it's a perfect time to be productive. I'm personally cozying up in my comfy knitted sweater watching these classes to improve my writing. The first 500 people to use my link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. Get started and become a member of the largest online learning community online. Thank you so much to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. And now let's get back to talking about fake Shakespearean English. To make things easier to explain, I've made this chart. I'll use the example of the pronoun I, then I'll explain how thou works. Alright, so we use I when it's the subject of the sentence. For example, I pet the dog. Here, I'm the subject of the sentence, so I would use I rather than me. We use the word me when we're the object of the sentence. For example, the cat scratched me. Here, I am the receiver of the action, so I have to use me and not I. Notice how the cat scratched I is grammatically incorrect. Now let's look at the word my, which you may already know shows possession. More specifically, it is a possessive adjective since you put it before a noun that is being possessed. So, for example, I can say, that is my dog. There's also the possessive pronoun, which is the noun form of my. For example, you can say, that dog is mine. Basically, mine is used instead of my when there's no noun to attach it to. But why did I explain these different versions of I? Aren't we here to talk about thou? Well, these different versions of I perfectly correspond to the different versions of thou, grammatically speaking. For example, thou is used as the subject of the sentence, so you would say, thou makest a meal, since thou is the one doing the action. Now we go on to thee, which is just like me, and that it acts like an object of the sentence. So we can have a sentence like, the cat scratched thee, since thee is the one being scratched. Next is thy, which acts just like my, marking the possession of another noun. For example, thy cat scratched me. Here, we are showing that the cat is possessed by thy. Next, we have thine, which acts just like mine. So if a friend comes up to me asking which coffee mug is his, I might say, that one is thine, and this one is mine. And there you have it, the various forms of thou explained in a neat little chart. I'll also add the various forms of you, just for comparison. Also, I kinda lied about this being all there is to it. I previously said that thine and mine are only used when there isn't a noun attached to it, but there's an exception. If the word after thy and my starts with a vowel, they typically turn into thine and mine, respectively. This is just like how the indefinite article a can turn into an when the next word starts with a vowel sound. So, although you might expect to say thy apple or my heart, it would actually become thine apple and mine art. Since the H sound in heart wasn't always pronounced, that's why we used mine instead of my. Okay, Just one last exception, I promise. You might have heard the quote, "Wherefore art thou, Romeo?" You might wonder, why does Juliet use thou and not thee, since it appears to be in the object position in the sentence? Well, there is a certain category of verbs called linking verbs, which don't describe an action, but rather a state of being. This includes verbs like is, am, seem, appear, was, and you guessed it, art. With linking verbs, you would actually use the subject pronoun. So rather than it is me or it's me, you would say it is I. Same goes for thou. Rather than saying wherefore art thee, you would say wherefore art thou, just as Juliet said. Alright, now we've learned everything about thou, right? Well, no, because often than not, people also get the conjugations for thou wrong. You know how in other languages like Spanish, you have to change the verb to match the subject? Like comer becomes como for first person singular, and then it becomes comes for second person singular. Well, we used to do a similar thing in English as well. I mean, we still kind of do it, but it's with the third person singular where you add the s to the verb for he, she, it. Like in the sentence, she walks, rather than she walk. But the conjugation system was more complex back then. For thou, you would add the est ending to the verbs. So we get a verb like drink, then add est to the end of it to get drinkest. Now we have a correctly conjugated verb and can say a sentence like thou drinkest orange juice. Pretty simple, right? Although there are some irregular verbs that you need to keep in mind. One you might be familiar with is the conjugation of to be, which is art. This would give you a sentence like, thou art mine. Some other irregular verb conjugations include thou hast, thou dost, thou shalt, thou wilt. Also, it's thou must. It stays exactly the same since it already has the est ending at the end of it. Okay, but besides the thou conjugation of verbs, there's also another conjugation that many people either use incorrectly or just not at all. Remember how I talked about how in modern English we add s to the end of verbs for the third person singular? For example, we don't say he walk, she eat, it talk. We say he walks, she eats, it talks. Well, during the Shakespearean era, rather than adding an s, they would add the eth to the end of verbs for the third person singular. So we would get he walketh, she eateth, it talketh. So remember, est for thou and eth for he, she, it. Now that we've got thou out of the way, let's look at some vocabulary that is often misused. Let's look back at Juliet's quote, "Wherefore art thou, Romeo?" We already talked about why thou is used instead of thee, but what does wherefore mean? Well, it doesn't actually have anything to do with where, although it's in the word. Wherefore is the same as saying for what reason, or just simply why. This makes sense because in this moment, Juliet has realized that Romeo is supposed to be her enemy, and yet she loves him. So she's basically saying, why you gotta be Romeo? Another word that people use incorrectly is the word whence. You have probably watched a fantasy movie where the character says something like, go back from whence you came. However, the phrase from whence is repetitive because the word whence already means from where. So it's kind of like saying from where. However, it does appear that Shakespeare and other literary works during this period did use from before whence. So it appears to not necessarily be incorrect if we look at it from a descriptivist point of view. But if we were to look at it in a prescriptive kind of sense, then the phrase go back from whence you came should actually be go back whence you came. But once again, this quote-unquote correct way of using whence seems to be a more modern complaint. Anyways, I also wanted to talk about these signs you see on buildings that are supposed to have a medieval feel to them. Did you know that ye isn't really a word? Or at least not the word you think it is. It's actually supposed to be the word the. But why did they use the letter Y? Well, this goes back to the printing press. Back in the day, English had the letters thorn and eth. They represent the sounds that they make. The thorn letter represented an unvoiced dental fricative, like the th in the words think, thought, ether. Meanwhile, the eth letter represented a voiced dental fricative, like the th in the, though, either. As you can see, although these are two completely different sounds, we now represent them using the same two letters, t and h. Anyways, why do I bring these old letters up? Well, the word the used to be spelled with thorn. However, with the invention of the printing press, things begin to change. You see, most of the printing presses were imported into England from Germany or the Netherlands. But the thing is, German and Dutch didn't use the letter thorn or eth, so these printing presses didn't include these letters. This created a problem for English printers who wanted to use the letter thorn. So they decided to substitute the thorn with the letter Y, since they look similar in the font that they used back then. This is what led to the usage of ye olde rather than the old. But eventually over time, we decided to use the letters T and H to represent the sound rather than Y. But ye old was kept to indicate a feeling of old and medieval. Okay, but what did ye actually mean? Well, back then, ye was used the same way as we use y'all. We use it when we're addressing multiple people, although it can get a bit confusing because it's also used as singular if you're being formal with the other person. So basically, it was kind of interchangeable with the word you. Over time, you slowly took over ye as the main form. I mean, by Shakespeare's time, ye was already considered kind of archaic and not really used at all. Then, during the Shakespearean age, you began to overtake thou as well. This left us with a second person singular, but now we didn't really have a pronoun for second person plural. This is why various dialects in English have filled in this missing piece by creating their own second person plural. Anyways, that's all the general misconceptions that I can think of, but if there's any misused words, phrases, or grammar from Shakespearean English that you know about, leave them down in the comments below. We've come to the end, so I'd like to once again thank my Patreon supporters. Without y'all, these videos wouldn't be put out as often. Thank you to Aspen, Drekmore, Pango, Warden Actual, Zergon, Braden, Hayim, Manrock1, and Michael McNay. If you're interested in sponsor-free videos available up to a week early, I'll leave a link to my Patreon in the description box below. Anyways, that's all for me. Ciao!